All right, that looks like that is up and running. And as we do have a bit of history to get through, we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, I say we have a bit of history to get through because we are talking about the establishment of the modern state of Israel. We're not going back to the time of David and the time of Joshua and all of that. We're talking about the modern state of Israel, what's called Medinat Yisrael. But even though this is going to be a two-part class and it'll give us a total of about 2 hours, it is just scratching the surface of the history of the modern state of Israel. The modern state of Israel may be a little over 100 years old. Well, actually, now it's more like 150 from its inception to its to the modern day. But those 150 years have been very eventful and have a lot of history behind them. So we're going to divide it into two parts, pre-1948 and from 1948 onwards. But I just want you to know that what we're going to be doing tonight is just a very broad surface view to try and get an understanding of how it is that the state of Israel, the modern democracy of Israel, came to exist in the middle of the 20th century. And then next class, we'll talk about what has happened since it came to be, and from 1948 up until the modern times. So let's dive in. So the first thing we have to realize is that even though we are talking about the modern state of Israel, that doesn't mean that there weren't Jews living in Israel prior to 1948. In fact, there have been Jews living in Israel since the time of Joshua. There have been Jews living in Israel since roughly 3,000 years ago, give or take a century, depending upon your timeline that you're reading. And Israel has remained as the focus of our physical spirituality, with Jerusalem, of course, at the centerpiece of that, as evidenced by Psalm 137, which was recited by those Jews that were in Babylonia, that were exiled. Even during the Babylonian exile, of course, not every Jew had gone into exile, but those who did would recite, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour." Israel continued to be a focal point for our life, even in the diaspora. Now, after the Babylonian exile, many Jews, of course, returned, although many others continued to live in the Persian Empire. And those Jews that returned, many of them resisted Roman occupation, leading up to and through the different wars with Rome. And they also had to endure the harshness of Roman treatment and Roman law and Roman persecution. There were famines, there were droughts, there was religious, ethnic persecution through the Roman, and then the successor Byzantine, and then the Muslim, and then the Crusader, and then the Muslim again, and then the Ottoman empires, all the way up until the British took over following World War I. Jews have had a rough time, but there has always been a Jewish community in different cities throughout the land of Israel. However, since the time of Roman occupation, about 2,000 years ago, there has not been an independent Jewish nation. That is to say, there hasn't been a state that was actually free and clear to be Israel by itself, not as a vassal of the Romans and not as just an occupied territory of them or any other empire. So despite the Jewish presence, there wasn't a Jewish state. That is to say, there wasn't a state that was independent from all of these empires. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why did so many Jews leave if some stayed? Well, because staying, as I kind of hinted, wasn't very easy. The taxation of the different empires were often very harsh and especially targeted against Jews. There were so many problems that could lead to starvation, to drought, to other issues that would make life there hard. And that in turn led to a general state of poverty through most of the centuries for many of the Jewish communities. Those who stayed held on, and their courage and their determination should never be underappreciated. They are incredible generations of Jews who have been there for so long. But it was hard. And it was especially hard as a Jew. Even if someone belonged to another religion, they might be facing some of the difficulties of living under those territories. But being a Jew meant that at many different points in the history of the last 2,000 years, life in Israel was harder if you were a Jew. Studying Torah, practicing circumcision, the keeping of Shabbat, numerous acts of our faith and religion came under attack by Roman, by Christian, by Muslim rulers. And as such, living as a Jew was difficult on top of just living in the land. Of course, many other Jews were taken as slaves, first during the Roman times and then later during other empires. And this also helped strip the population. And to be frank, many of the established communities that were outside of Israel, in Europe, North Africa, and the rest of the Middle East, in the Persian area, they were doing better. There was more freedom, there was less suffering, and it was a safer place to live. So many Jews chose to emigrate outside of Israel in order to secure a better life for themselves, their family, and the next generation. However, that outflow was never enormous. It was never all at once. It wasn't as though all the Jews, except for 5 guys, got on a boat and left one day. It was a slow trickle out of the country, and it did keep the population from growing in Israel, but more importantly, it made the outside population continue to grow. In fact, we've only just begun to reach the tipping point in history where Israel has a majority of Jews within her borders, and that is for the first time in a few thousand years. So don't think of it as everybody left one day. Think of it as those who stayed had a hard time and didn't grow, and those who left and were part of the outside communities did continue to grow and thrive. But that was the old history. What about in the meantime? What kept people from just going? Why didn't the Jews who lived in Persia just all come back one day? Why didn't the Jews who lived in Europe all come back one day? Maybe it wouldn't have been an independent country. Maybe it wasn't going to be free. Maybe life was going to be hard. But it's Israel. It calls to us. It always has. Why not just get a mass movement all together and let's go? Well, because there were opinions that were against that idea. There are those who quoted from Psalms, Psalm 127, saying, "Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman keeps vigil in vain." What this has been meant to many different communities throughout the ages has been, in Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum's words, who is a opponent of the modern state of Israel. Even if the members of the Knesset, the parliament in Israel, were righteous and holy, and he did not think they were, unfortunately, it is a terrible and awful criminal iniquity to seize redemption and rule before the time has come. Essentially, the Satmars and many other Hasidic Jews and many Orthodox Jews in the 1800s, which will be our focal point in just a minute, were opposed to any organized return to the land of Israel, believing that should only happen during the clear, shining light of the Messianic age of Mashiach, as we talked about in our portion on the afterlife. That only when Mashiach was revealed would there be a mass movement to return to the borders of Israel. And anything prior to that was considered to be a religious affront, that this was arrogance of the people. And so he and many others opposed Jewish resettlement in the land of Israel, and many of them still do to this day. And if we look at the text of the Talmud, is there any support for this opinion? Well, yes, there are some opinions that do seem to lean this way. But like in all things, the Talmud has multiple layers and multiple opinions. As Rav Yehuda said, anyone who ascends, in this case meaning moves from Babylonia to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, transgresses a positive mitzvah, as it is stated from the book of Jeremiah, They shall be taken to Babylonia, and there they shall remain until that day that I call them, said the Lord. Sounds like if you go to Babylon, you have to stay there until God calls you, meaning Mashiach. And Rabbi Zera, his opponent in the argument, he says that verse is written about the temple service vessels. It does not refer to the Jewish people. As the previous verse states, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, concerning the vessels that remain in the house of the Lord, taken from Jeremiah 27:21. So the they pronoun that is found in Jeremiah 27, Rabbi Zera argues that pronoun is pointing at the vessels, it's not pointing at the people. And for the people to return would be fine. However, we find also in the Talmud the argument that there are 3 oaths found in Song of Songs, and the citations are there on the page. And what were they needed for? 1 oath so that the Jews should not ascend to Eretz Israel as a wall, meaning as a mass group, and another one that the Holy One, blessed be He, adjured the Jews that they should not rebel against the nations of the world. And the last one is that the Holy One, blessed be He, adjured the nations of the world that they should not subjugate the Jews excessively. So the argument here is that we are allowed to go piece by piece, person by person, but we shouldn't make it a mass movement. But you'll notice that there was also a contingency that not only will we respect and honor the other nations of the world, but they too will not overly persecute us. And as we're going to talk about, that last one in particular, that contract was broken as the persecution of Jews reaches a fever pitch at the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. So yes, coming as an individual, perfectly fine. Indeed, a husband in the ancient world could tell his entire house, we're going to Israel and you're coming too. But if that same husband wanted to leave Israel, he could not force his house to go, meaning his other members of his family. So there was definitely room to come up as a group, at least family by family. That was always supported. However, there was a big reason why the 1800s saw a shift in the attitude of many people. And first was the idea of self-determination, and the second was the rising anti-Semitism in Europe. Now, the two are connected, as we talked a little bit about the Enlightenment period and what it meant for Jews in Europe. The idea of self-determination meant that the different nations of Europe were more and more eager, and many of the people who were part of those nations were more eager, to define themselves based upon some ethnic cultural definition. France for the French, Germany for the Germans. And they often had to invent the concepts of what it meant to be French or German. And in many of those conversations, well, we were left out. That is to say, the Jew was outside of those definitions, those identities of these new nations. But many Jewish people did say, well, if self-determination is all the rage, if this is something that is believed to be a inherent right of all humanity, then that means, too, the Jew should have the right to self-determination. And if we're not being given that right within Europe, and this form of Zionism was originally a European construction, then we need to go somewhere else where we can be in charge of our own life, where we can have our own self-determination. Now, that idea may not have won over a lot of people if it weren't for the second point, which is life in Europe was getting harder and harder. The Western European nations had long ago expelled many Jews, and although some had returned, life there was still hard and anti-Semitism was still rampant. And the further east you went, life was not only plagued by anti-Semitism, but it was made unbearable by attacks and laws, attacks such as what are called the pogroms. Pogroms were contained within what we would now call the Russian Empire or the Russian sphere. And these were government-created, organized riots, massacres of Jewish communities, where they would come in and they would brutalize, murder, and rob the Jewish towns as a group. And this, of course, made a lot of Jews want to leave. Now, a few million of them left and went to the New World, finding homes in the United States, in Canada, in Central and South America. Some also ended up in South Africa. But many other Jews said, well, that's only pushing off the problem. If the real issue is nobody wants us in their borders, then even going to a more friendly country doesn't mean we will permanently be safe. The only thing we can do is to combine the self-protection with self-determination, and that means we need our own place. We need our own country. And that is the birth of what we would now call the Zionist ideal, that there needs to be a place for Jews to live, that they can have the right to guide their own life, and they can have the right to protect themselves and any other Jews that may be in danger from any other country. And this really began to get off the ground in the late 1800s. And the different waves of immigration to Israel have been defined by historians into different aliyot. Aliyot is the term for the ascending, the rising, the term that's used for immigrating into Israel. And the first Aliyah was or is considered to have run from 1882 to 1903. Now, we saw about 35,000 Jewish immigrants come to Israel during this time. Most of them were from Russia and from Romania, where there were similar problems. And during this time, what they did is they would come in, they would settle the land, and they would purchase the land. Now, the land was mostly owned by the Ottoman Empire. If you're not familiar with your Middle Eastern history, you can go back and brush up on that on your own time. But short lesson: the Ottoman Empire, which is based in Turkey, controlled most of what we would now call the Middle East, going all the way down through Israel and into Egypt. Now, that's going to change over time, but at this time, the Ottomans are in charge. And that means that the Ottomans mostly own the land in what we would now call Israel. So when the Jews wanted to come and settle, they wanted to buy land. Who are they buying the land from? Well, they're not buying the land from the local residents, because the local residents don't own the land. Instead, they buy the land from the owners in the Ottoman Empire. And most of the land was purchased for a much higher price than might be considered fair, because honestly, the land wasn't that great. Now, the local residents, well, they were mostly tenant farmers or other people within the area, and they had been paying rent to the Ottoman landowners, and now they were a little upset. Why? Well, partly because new people are coming in, partly because these new people look European. And as we all know, by the middle and end of the 1800s, European colonialism was very much obvious in many other parts of the world. And many of the local residents were convinced that the Jews coming to the land of Israel were European colonists. Obviously, that is not how the Jews saw themselves, and it's not how the Europeans saw them. After all, if the Europeans had considered the Jews Europeans, many of the Jews would never have felt the push to leave that country or that continent. Additionally, when the Jews came and settled and purchased the land, they wanted to work the land. They wanted to be farmers and shepherds and growers of grapes and fruit. And that meant that the tenant farmers were no longer able to work the land that they might have been tenant farmers of for multiple generations. That kind of thing should make a person bitter and angry, I understand. Unfortunately, their anger was not at the landowner who had sold it, who lived up in the Ottoman Empire. Their anger was at the person who lived there now, meaning the Jewish immigrant. And this created an atmosphere of tension that will, in about 20 years, really come to a huge boiling point. Now, at the same time, during the first Aliyah was the first Zionist Congress. And this first Zionist Congress, which was held in 1897 and orchestrated by Theodor Herzl, who is really considered the architect of bringing together all of these ideas and putting it into a workable form, was designed to help coordinate all of these efforts. And during the Zionist Congress, they established certain principles. As you can see, Zionist aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. Now, why was it called Palestine? Because that was what the Romans had renamed the territory of Judea, what we would call Israel, following their destruction and conquest and putting down of Jewish revolts. It was done as an insult by renaming it in the title of our enemies, the Philistines, Palestine or Palestinia being the Latin equivalent. And that was the name that had stuck on the maps since the Roman time. And it was a neutral term for that territorial division. Now, for the attainment of this purpose, to make it happen, the Congress considers the following means serviceable: the promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. That's immigration and setting up shop. The federation of all Jews into local or general groups according to the laws of various countries, meaning that Jews around the world should also work together to form stronger alliances. And you may notice that term federation. And indeed, this is where we get the beginning of Jewish federations, Jewish organizations that help to coordinate Jewish life locally, nationally, and globally. 3, the strengthening of Jewish feeling and consciousness. That is to say, helping people to feel more in touch with their Judaism and to preserve things like language, culture, art, and history. 4, preparatory steps for the attainment of those governmental grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose. Also with this, they adopted Hatikva as the national anthem. Now, number 4 is going to become very important later on, and it is a very practical statement. The land that we wanted to recreate a Jewish homeland in was owned by another country. At this time, it was owned, like I mentioned, by the Ottoman Empire, centered up in Turkey. That meant that there would need to be cooperation with the Ottomans in order to allow us to have our own place within their space. And it also would mean that eventually there would need to be recognition by other states of the creation of this Jewish land. All those things will happen in due course, but of course there is a lot of history that's going to take place before 1948. The second Aliyah is marked from 1904 to 1914, meaning the beginning of World War I. During this time, we see another 40,000 immigrants, again, mainly from Russia. During this time, we also see a strong socialist tendency among many of the immigrants and the foundation of many of the kibbutzim, the collective farms. These were voluntary, collaborative farming endeavors where people wouldn't own the property, it would be owned by the collective. In many ways, it was a voluntary form of socialism or communism, depending upon the individual group. Also at this time, Tel Aviv was founded. You can look up the great pictures of just the miles of sand and a bunch of people smiling with a shovel. And that became the amazing city of Tel Aviv that is there today. Also during this time period, Hebrew was revived as a conversational language. Obviously, we'd had Hebrew for a few thousand years, and Hebrew was still used in Jewish study and Jewish prayer. However, it was not spoken as just a conversational language. You didn't invite someone over to have tea and coffee and then sit around talking about the latest books in Hebrew. It was reserved for sacred activities. However, earlier on in the late 1800s, Eliezer ben Yehuda and many others worked with him, although he really did the lion's share, tried to revive Hebrew as a conversational modern language and to allow it to form the backbone of what would become Hebrew culture in the modern world. And learn more about him if you can. It is a fascinating story of how you take a language and revitalize it and put it back into common usage. World War I happens in 1914, and this throws everything into chaos. However, during World War I, a new opportunity, a new hope began to shine on the idea of establishing a Jewish state. And that is to say that the Ottoman Empire came in to the war on the side of Germany. Well, they came into the war on the opposite side to Russia, with whom they have been struggling for years. But that meant that they were now opposite the French and British.
And that meant when World War I was done, the Ottoman Empire was divided by the French and British empires. It was cut up. And during this time, the British end up in control of the Palestinian area. Now, we're going to see a picture of that in just a second. But prior to the success of World War I and prior to the British taking over, the British issue a proclamation. It's called the Balfour Declaration. And what the Balfour Declaration was trying to do was to encourage Jews, both in Britain as well as around the world, to support the British side in World War I in order to secure British support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the land that had been settled. Now, how do they describe that in the Declaration? Well, it's quite short, so I'll read it. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So there are three main points to this. One, the British government is promising to help to establish a Jewish homeland. Two, that homeland should not in any way infringe on the rights of the people that are there that are not Jewish. And three, that Jews who don't live in that homeland, meaning in any other country, should not be treated badly or differently despite the establishment of this new country, which was a serious concern. After all, with anti-Semitism so bad in Europe, there were some that felt that if the Jews established a homeland, that all the Jews of Europe should be rounded up and forcibly relocated there. The Balfour Declaration is saying, no, we're not going to treat the Jews of England differently just because we're supporting the establishment of this homeland. So as the British take over, they adopt many of the partitions and structure of the administrative territory that is found by the Ottomans. And during this period, this entire area is known as the British Mandate for Palestine. Now, you'll see that this goes far beyond what we would recognize as being Israel. Indeed, it includes Israel and what we would call the modern state of Jordan. You can also see that the French controlled what we would call Syria and Lebanon. The British controlled Egypt. The British also controlled Iraq and what will eventually become Kuwait. And there was a great deal of cooperation with what we would now call Saudi Arabia. So this whole territory was now under French and British control. And unfortunately, they acted as colonial powers the same way they had done in other parts of the world. There were attempts that were designed specifically to extract the wealth from these territories in order to enrich the British and French territory, or British and French governments and nations. Not great, and going to add to the problems that have already been brewing. This leads us to the third Aliyah from 1919 to 1923. And with the British mandate, things get a little different. Again, we still see that there are 40,000 immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. We also see that there is a rapid advance of Jewish agriculture, of the changing of the swamps, the clearing up of the waterways that had been blocked. Those swamps were not natural to the area, but were a remnant, a relic of the misuse of much of the area of Israel. And because of growing friction between the Arab groups and the Jewish groups, the Jews began to also organize their own protective organizations known collectively as the Haganah. This was a militia that was designed to help keep Jewish towns and Jewish farms safe. Now, the British had a deal with the people that would become the leaders of Jordan. During World War I, they had promised them a lot too. And in order to keep their promise to them, they divided the partition and put the the east bank of the Jordan into their hand, what is often referred to as Transjordan at this time, because it was across the Jordan, which meant that the area that was going to be called the Palestine Mandate had shrunk to the strip of land that now is a much more familiar shape. Obviously, this is going to make things harder when it comes time to establish a Jewish homeland, with a majority of the land having already been removed from the pot and given to a different king in gratitude for their work during World War I, and to allow that family to now, well, take over as dictators. Which leads us to the fourth Aliyah, which you can see was a much smaller window, yet still had 82,000 immigrants coming in, this time mostly from Poland and Romania. And we see the establishment of more and more Jewish towns and more light industry coming in. It's not only farmers now, it's also people who are doing the basic work of industrialization in these areas. And we're going to come back to 1929 in just a second, but before we do, I just want to bring us up to the last great wave of immigration, which is 1929 to 1939. And this period saw about 250,000 immigrants coming in, and you can probably guess why. This was a time period where life was becoming harsher and harsher in both Eastern Europe and especially in Germany. And many Jews were fleeing and saw the territory of Palestine, as it was still called at the time, as their best bet. We'll talk about why they didn't come to America in just a second, but what we end up with at the end of 1940 was about 450,000 Jews living in the area that we would now recognize as the borders of Israel. There would have been more, but immigration policies by the British prevented many from going there. And actually, hold on a second. All right, let's go to this one, then we'll go back, because I want you to understand the immigration policies before we see the other side. So the British were obviously very worried about keeping the peace in their mandate territories. They weren't there to make life better, they were there to extract wealth. And the more fighting that happened among the people who lived there, the less they could get. So they wanted to remove any friction. One of the things they did then was to limit and then eventually prohibit Jewish immigration in order to preserve what they called the current balance, the status quo, if you will, of the ratio between the Jews and the non-Jews in the territory, trying to maintain this balance as they intended it. Of course, that meant that many hundreds of thousands of Jews who wanted to go to Israel could not. That, of course, is going to be very important when we get to 1948 and we're trying to divide the territories based upon the population distribution in the land. Had the British allowed more people to come into the land of Israel at the time, it certainly would have tipped the balance in different directions. And it might have also saved hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost in the Holocaust. You might be wondering, why didn't the Jews just go to the United States if life in Europe was so bad? Well, during the 1920s and 30s, US immigration law continued its march towards ever-increasing racism and anti-Semitism. Jews were simply not allowed. It was against American law for Jews to come into the land. It was also against American law for Chinese and Japanese people as well. But as we're talking about the foundation of Israel, we'll focus on that. But if you are ever unclear about the history of American immigration, go back and study the laws of this period, and it is a shameful shameful chapter in our history. And of course, that meant that unable to go into Europe, unable to go into America, unable to go into Palestine, hundreds of thousands of Jews were trapped in the area that would eventually become consumed by the fires of the Holocaust. Now, many Jews did fight back against this. Many of them protested, many of them had other movements to try and change the policies of different countries. Many of them smuggled Jews into other countries, and in particular into Palestine under the British mandate. And unfortunately, many of them also engaged in not only military action, but in what is rightly called terrorism, attacking civilian targets within the British mandate
as a way of intimidating them to try and gain support. Like most acts of terrorism, it did not achieve the desired result. So what's going on the Arab side is equally important during this time period between World War I and World War II. In 1929, there were massive riots in Hebron, and those riots spread to other parts of the land of Israel. Now, these riots were started by lies and rumors, but the damage and the murder that were done were very real. And as a response, the British decided to crack down harder. In the 1936 to 1939 period, right as World War II is just beginning, the Arabs decide that they wish to revolt against the British. They wish to become independent. They wish to be in charge of the country themselves and not so kindly deal with the Jews who they don't like. And so there was a huge revolt. There was an uprising of the Arabs against the British occupation. Now, in the process, many Jews were attacked. As I mentioned, they were already the object of their anger, and many Jews fought back as part of armed militias. This becomes a very important training ground for Jewish soldiers that will be necessary in 1948 when that war happens as well. The British were especially brutal in putting down this Arab revolt. They massacred, they tortured, they slaughtered the Arabs, and they were brutal. There really is no other word for it. I know that many people think of England as being very genteel, but we have to remember that there is a dark past of colonial power, and the British had gotten very good at crushing local revolts against their authority. And when they crushed this revolt, not only did it cause much pain and suffering, but it also very effectively removed many of these secular leaders from the Arab world. By remove, I mean either imprisoned or simply killed. The only people that were not openly attacked, that were still remaining as leaders, were of religious groups. This means, of course, that one of the seeds for the eventual rise of radical fundamentalist Islam in the 20th century is planted right here, because of the way the British handled the uprising and the uprising in other parts of the British territory as well, and the French too. Oftentimes, it was only under religious leaders that people were able to organize, which led to a great deal of suffering in the 20th and still in the 21st century. Now, the British are already talking about getting out of this territory because this area does not have a great deal of wealth. And so they are talking about dividing the land, making a Jewish state and making an Arab state, and keeping a small slice with Jerusalem and with a path down to the sea so that they would have access. As you can see, this is not the borders that eventually will become the Jewish state, but this was the plan in 1937. It was never presented, it was never agreed upon by anyone, but this was the direction that they were thinking at that time. World War II happens. Obviously, any plans were put on hold because they had a war to fight. It also showed us during World War II that there really did need to be a Jewish homeland, a Jewish safe harbor, with the millions dead in the Holocaust just underlining what we had already known, which was that without a place for Jews to go, Jews could never be truly safe. We could recognize in the hindsight that if the millions who had wanted to emigrate had been allowed to, they would not have died, and that this means there really needed to be a change. After the war, the United Kingdom is still refusing to admit most refugees, and other countries as well are still reluctant to take on Jewish refugees. And Israel becomes, legally or illegally, a destination for refugees. The communist takeover of Eastern Europe means that many other Jews are also reluctant to return to their homes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern Bloc countries, because the Soviet Union is not being friendly to Jews either.
although they're not perpetrating the same level of Holocaust determination to exterminate, the open and free practice of Judaism is definitely frowned upon within the Soviet Union and the territories under its control. Nevertheless, about 100,000 people are able to immigrate after the war and before 1948. Now, one of the common misconceptions is that Israel was established because of the Holocaust. And I hope you can see so far that Israel was already a dream, and a dream being put into action for almost 50 years prior to the Holocaust happening. The Holocaust may have created some sympathy, and the Holocaust may have created some clarity for some nations that perhaps this was needed. And it may have also been that following the Holocaust and the establishment of the Cold War, that the need for perhaps an ally in the oil-rich areas of the Middle East might also be advantageous. So there are both moral and ethical reasons and strategic reasons of why the establishment of Israel might have ended up in 1948, but we cannot forget the work that was being done for more than 50 years by all of the early Zionists coming to the land of Israel. If not for them, nothing would have happened after the Holocaust. There would not have been a Jewish land in there at all. And the hundreds of thousands of Jews who already lived in Israel that had left Europe before the Holocaust, they most likely would have perished as well. So more could have been done, but let's not forget what already had been done, and against the incredible odds of so many obstacles that were put in the way of trying to establish the Jewish homeland. So since we have finished World War II, we've established this new thing called the United Nations, and the United Nations is being given the job by the British to figure out what to do with this territory. The British no longer want responsibility. They are essentially handing it over to the United Nations for its decision. And on November 29th, 1947, the General Assembly votes 33-13 with 10 abstentions and one person absent in favor of the Partition Plan, which we'll see in just a moment. Now, this UN Resolution 181 opened the door for two states to be established, both Israel, meaning the state of Israel, that would have a Jewish majority, and an Arab state, which would have a non-Jewish majority. Now, obviously, this is not quite what the Jews were looking for all the way back in the 1880s when they first came. They were hoping for something that matched closer to the full borders of Israel at its height. However, getting something rather than nothing, especially in light of the many hundreds of thousands of refugees looking for a home, was considered more important than holding out for the absolute best case scenario. And the Israeli, or what would become the Israeli, the Jewish people who lived in the territory agreed with this resolution. However, the Arabs that lived there did not. They refused to recognize the United Nations as having any say over the matter, and they refused to accept the idea that there could ever be a separate Jewish state in this territory. The Arab states that were surrounding Israel also refused to accept this partition. And as we'll see, this led to the First War, what's often referred to as the War of Independence. So what was the UN Partition Plan, and how was it going to be divided up? Well, it may look a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, but what they did was move from town to town to town, and assess the population proportions in each area, and try and draw a map that best encapsulated Jewish majority and non-Jewish majority territories. And then, in order to counterbalance what was a larger Arab portion, to give a large chunk of the Sinai, of the Negev desert, which was not really inhabited by many people at all, as a balancing of territory to the Jewish state. And this is the original borders that the United Nations had voted on in 1947. When May comes around in 1948 and the actual handover day is coming into fruition, what we call the 5th of Iyar, on the Jewish calendar, well, we're going to end up with a war.
Now, to understand exactly what we were looking at prior to that, just to make sure that we see the numbers, the Arab state, meaning the territory, the territory in this section would be approximately 725,000 Arab, meaning non-Jewish population, and about 10,000 Jews living in that territory. In the Jewish state, there would be about 407,000 Arabs and 498,000 Jews, which would leave the population about 55-45. And in the international zone around Jerusalem, there was a much closer even split. When this day comes around, the 5th of Iyar, the Independence Day for Israel, the government proclaims a declaration of independence. And it is a beautiful document. So if you will forgive me, I will read some of the most important sections of it for our class. In light of countless broken promises and continued humiliation of our people in the land of Israel by our own brothers and sisters, I would like to remind us of the principles upon which Israel was founded, as recorded in her Declaration of Independence. Please read the entire document tonight and be a champion of all its goals. That's my preamble. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books, Tanakh, the Bible. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. They made deserts bloom, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace, but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, a stand-in for God's name, we affix our signatures to this proclamation at this session of the Provisional Council of the State on the soil of the homeland and the city of Tel Aviv on this Sabbath Eve, the 5th day of Iyar, 5708, which is the 14th of May, 1948. So as you can see, the Declaration of Independence, and indeed the pattern of Israel's laws and life since then, was established to create a free country where people of different religions or different backgrounds would be able to live together in peace. Israel has an incredibly diverse community, both among its Jewish and non-Jewish population. And while there are always going to be cultural and social problems in any diverse community, as we can see from our own country, the United States, Israel has maintained a level of freedom and equality that is really unmatched in the region, and not well matched in many other countries outside the region either. Nevertheless, there was going to be war. But I wanted to make sure that we could just talk a little bit about the internal questions of Jew and Jew diversity. Because you may have noticed that many of the Jews who were coming in opposition to many of the religious ideals of some of those that called themselves Orthodox, more like we talked about in the movements video. And we can also know that many of the people who were living there were of a more traditional mindset. How is that going to work out? Well, as Theodor Herzl said, faith unites us. Knowledge gives us freedom. We shall therefore prevent any theocratic tendencies from coming to the fore on the part of our priesthood. We shall keep our priests within the confines of their temples, in the same way we shall keep our volunteer forces within the confines of their barracks. The same way that the soldier should not have any greater authority over the nation than the non-soldier, so too the religious Orthodox extremists should not have any more control over the nation than those that are of secular or non-Orthodox bent. And this was the vision that Herzl had, and the vision that was generally accepted by the vast majority of Israelis when Israel was being founded. However, with the tension among the ultra-Orthodox within the country at the time, there was an agreement, what's known as the status quo, that was negotiated between the secular government and the ultra-Orthodox citizens in order to gain their support. And this was what they said. Shabbat. Yes, it is clear the legal day of rest of the Jewish state will be Shabbat. Rather than making Sunday the day of rest, of course, we're going to make Shabbat, while of course allowing the members of other religions to rest on their weekly holiday. If you take off your Friday, if you take off Sunday because you are Muslim or Christian, that's perfectly fine, but the government will revolve around Saturday, Shabbat, as being the official day of rest. 2, kashrut. All necessary measures should be taken to ensure that every government kitchen which is serving Jews should have kosher food. 3, personal status. All members of the administration appreciate the seriousness of the problem and the major difficulties. Everything possible will be done to provide the deep needs of the religious, to avoid, God forbid, dividing the house of Israel into two. There was and continues to be a major concern that unless the majority of Israelis conform to the rulings of the minority of Israelis regarding who is married, who is divorced, and other personal status issues, or more famously, who even counts as a Jew, that you would end up with two different definitions on all of those topics, which would essentially tear the nation apart along religious lines. As such, Israel has continued to allow the minority ultra-Orthodox to dictate all of those topics. That's created a lot of problems, as we'll talk about in the modern form of Israel in our next session. And education. Full autonomy of each educational system will be guaranteed, and the government will not violate the religious status and religious conscience of any group of Jews. The state, of course, will determine minimum obligatory courses and will supervise compliance with this minimum. So this was also a compromise, that they would allow the religious institutions to continue to teach as they wish to teach, but the state would ensure that every student, every child would receive a decent secular education according to a minimum level. But of course, the real story of 1948 for most of us is going to be the war. Israel was attacked by a massive coalition of forces trying to stomp out its existence even as it was born. Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Arab Liberation Army, and other volunteers, which were made up of people more local or who had traveled from further away, all attacked. And as you can imagine, vastly outnumbered, outgunned the new Israeli country. Yet Israel won, or else we wouldn't be having this conversation. Now, there's a lot of reasons why Israel won. One, the Arabs were disunited. The Jordanians and the Syrians were not eager that the Egyptians have too much. The Egyptians didn't want the others to have too much. None of them sent all of their forces because none of them were willing to sacrifice too much for this particular cause. And they also did not coordinate the military movements of their different armies. The Israelis, obviously, were much more united, fighting from a central location and absolutely coordinating how they move their armies. It has been said that although the Israelis were vastly outnumbered in most of the major engagements of the war, they outnumbered their Arab opponents because they were able to redistribute the troops as needed from within Israel in order to combat any of the attacks that were coming at different times from the disunited Arab countries. Also, of course, the Arab armies were not fighting for survival. The Arab armies were fighting to kill. They were fighting to take, to conquer. The Israelis were fighting for their life. They knew that, as had been said repeatedly by the Arab attackers, if they won, they would drive the Jews into the sea, that it would be a second Holocaust. And so there was no option for surrender. The Israelis were going to have to fight until the end. Like I mentioned before, Israel also mobilized its entire population, and the Israelis are generally considered by most military historians to have had better training and equipment prior to the beginning of the war. Nonetheless, the victory of 1948 is still considered by most to be a miracle. It was very touch and go, and things absolutely could have gone the wrong way. But Israel was able to survive and eventually secure her borders. Now, we talked about this being the original partition plan, but by the end of the fighting, this was the new shape of the territory. Now, as you can see, the Arab state has shrunk considerably during the fighting. The territory that Israel was able to gain in order to secure her towns and people has expanded greatly. Just making sure you can see the difference back and forth there. Now, there was nothing magical about these lines that control what is now referred to as the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, the areas that were left not as part of Israel. Those lines were simply determined based upon the troop locations. As you can see, Israel tried to get to Jerusalem in order to secure and defend the Jewish population there. Unfortunately, while it was able to secure what we would call the new city, meaning outside the walls of Jerusalem, it was not able to capture the old city, the more postcard version of Jerusalem. That is something that will become very problematic after the war is over. But this territory was then not in part of Israel, and this territory was not part of Israel either. And this would have been a beautiful opportunity for the Arabs of those territory to enact the UN resolution and establish themselves as an independent state, something which they honestly should have done when this was the initial division. Unfortunately, for them and for history, they were not allowed to do so, not because of Israel, but because Egypt seized control of the Gaza Strip and Jordan seized control of the West Bank. As I mentioned before, the Arab armies were not really there for the good and welfare of the people who lived in that territory. They were there for their own agenda and their own hope of victory and gain. As such, when the war was over, both Jordan and Egypt took what they thought was their due. And this, of course, prevented the establishment of a separate Arab nation within any of this territory, something which has continued until this day, which we will talk about in much greater detail during next week's class. All right, almost 1 hour on the dot. We have gone through a lot of history. Like I mentioned, it is only the tiniest fraction of history. There are entire books written about different aliyot, the different phases of Jewish immigration. There are, of course, books written about all of Jewish history that are, 4 foot thick. There is a lot more to learn and a lot more to understand. But hopefully this will give you at least a little bit of context and understanding for how Israel came to be an independent country again, and some of the issues that continue to plague us all the way into the 21st century, and how they began during this time as well. But we'll talk more about that next week when we go to part 2.